The classroom at Columbia University hummed with quiet tension. It was a cavernous space with rows of wooden desks arranged in a steep amphitheater style, each one filled with students clutching notebooks and pens. The air smelled faintly of chalk and old textbooks, a scent that mingled seamlessly with the muffled rustling of paper and the occasional cough. At the front of the room, the blackboard stretched across the wall like a blank canvas, its surface crisscrossed with faint smears of erased equations. Professor Eleanor Whitman stood at the center of this academic coliseum, a figure of authority and precision. She was in her mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair tied back in a severe bun and rectangular glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Her tailored suit was as sharp as her words, and her presence commanded respect, or perhaps fear. Whitman was a mathematician of renowned intellect, her lectures demanding an almost surgical focus from her students. She had no patience for mediocrity, no tolerance for those who faltered under pressure. To her, mathematics was not just a subject but a discipline, an art form that required absolute precision. She scanned the classroom with a cold, assessing gaze, her sharp eyes darting from one student to the next, as though she could measure their worth by the way they held their pens. "Mathematics," she began, her voice cutting through the silence, "is not a game of guesses. It is a pursuit of truth, and truth demands discipline." In the third row, Malcolm Hayes sat quietly, his hands folded on the desk. He was a young black man of 19, tall and lean, with an air of quiet confidence that set him apart. While the other students scribbled frantically in their notebooks, Malcolm simply observed, his dark eyes fixed on the professor. Unlike his peers, he didn't feel the need to prove himself through performative note-taking or nervous nodding. He absorbed the material like a sponge, his mind working at a speed that even he sometimes found surprising. Malcolm was not the kind of student who sought attention. He didn't raise his hand to answer every question, or engage in the competitive posturing that many of his classmates indulged in. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, his mind was a whirlwind of numbers, equations, and patterns. Mathematics was his language, his sanctuary. It was a world where everything made sense, where logic and creativity coexisted in perfect harmony. But Malcolm had noticed something about Professor Whitman. She was meticulous in her treatment of students, yet her interactions with him always carried a subtle edge. A slight narrowing of the eyes when he spoke, a faint hesitation before acknowledging his correct answers, a tone of skepticism that lingered just a moment too long. It wasn't overt hostility. Whitman was too professional for that. But it was there, unspoken, yet undeniable. Malcolm had learned to navigate the unspoken biases that sometimes came his way, both in and out of the classroom. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, he had faced his share of challenges, but his love for mathematics had always been his guiding light. Numbers didn't judge. Equations didn't care about the color of his skin. In the world of math, he was free. As Whitman turned to the blackboard and began writing a complex equation with swift, deliberate strokes, Malcolm shifted in his seat. He could feel the familiar stirrings of curiosity and excitement building within him. This was what he lived for, the thrill of problem-solving, the rush of discovery. But today something felt different. The tension in the room was sharper than usual, the stakes higher. Malcolm's instincts told him that this class would not be like the others. Something was about to change. Professor Whitman's classroom was a crucible, a place where the weak were separated from the strong. She prided herself on her ability to push her students to their limits, to strip away any pretense or overconfidence until all that remained was raw intellect. Her lessons were meticulously planned, her equations carefully selected for their complexity and elegance. To her, mathematics was a flawless machine, and she expected her students to approach it with the same reverence she did. "Now," she said, underlining the equation she had just written on the board, "who can tell me the next step in solving this?" The room fell silent. It wasn't that the students didn't know the answer, some of them likely did, but answering Professor Whitman's questions was a gamble. If you were correct, she might offer a curt nod of approval, but if you were wrong, her sharp critique could cut deeper than any insult. Most students preferred to avoid the risk altogether. Malcolm, as usual, did not raise his hand. He had already solved the equation in his head almost instinctively, but he saw no need to draw attention to himself. He wasn't here to compete with his classmates or to earn Whitman's approval. He was here for the math. Whitman's eyes scanned the room, her gaze lingering briefly on Malcolm before moving on. "No one," she asked, her voice tinged with disappointment. If you can't handle this, then you're wasting your time in my class. A hand shot up in the first row. It belonged to Emily Carter, one of Whitman's star students. Blonde, confident, and impeccably prepared, Emily was the kind of student Whitman seemed to favor. She spoke with the assuredness of someone who was used to being right. The next step is to isolate the variable, Emily said, her voice crisp and clear. We can rearrange the equation to incorrect. Whitman interrupted, her tone slicing through Emily's words like a knife. You've skipped several steps. Precision, Miss Carter, precision. Emily's face flushed with embarrassment as she sank back into her seat. Malcolm felt a pang of sympathy for her. He knew how it felt to be underestimated, though for different reasons. Whitman turned back to the board, her chalk hovering over the equation. Anyone else? She asked, though her tone suggested she didn't expect an answer. Malcolm hesitated. He wasn't the kind of person who liked to stand out, but something about Whitman's dismissive attitude compelled him to speak up. Slowly, he raised his hand. Yes, Mr. Hayes, Whitman said, arching an eyebrow. Her voice was neutral, but there was a faint undercurrent of skepticism, as though she doubted he had anything worthwhile to contribute. The next step, Malcolm said calmly, is to simplify the coefficients. From there you can solve for the variable without needing to rearrange the entire equation. For a moment there was silence. Whitman studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned back to the board and followed his instructions. The equation unraveled beautifully, each step flowing seamlessly into the next. Well, she said, setting down the chalk, it seems you're correct. Her acknowledgement was brief, almost begrudging. But in that moment, Malcolm felt the weight of the classroom's attention shift toward him. He could sense the other students watching him, their curiosity mingled with surprise. He had always been somewhat of an enigma to them, a quiet presence in the background, neither seeking nor receiving recognition. But now, for the first time, he was at the center of the room's focus. Whitman, however, seemed determined to move on. Let's continue, she said briskly, erasing the equation with quick, forceful strokes. But Malcolm could see the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her hand gripped the eraser just a little too tightly. He had challenged her authority, however unintentionally, and it was clear she didn't like it. Over the next few weeks, Malcolm noticed a subtle shift in Whitman's behavior toward him. Her skepticism became more pronounced, her questions more pointed. She began calling on him more frequently, often with problems that were noticeably more difficult than those she assigned to the rest of the class. It was as though she was testing him, waiting for him to make a mistake. But Malcolm didn't falter. Each time she challenged him, he rose to the occasion, his answers precise and unshakable. Yet, no matter how many times he proved himself, Whitman's demeanor remained unchanged. She nodded curtly at his correct answers, but never offered the kind of encouragement or praise she gave to other students. One afternoon, as the class was packing up their things, Whitman approached Malcolm's desk. Mr. Hayes, she said, her tone clipped. A word. Malcolm looked up, his expression calm. Yes, Professor? I've noticed your aptitude, she said, as though the word itself pained her. It's unusual. Thank you, Malcolm replied evenly. Whitman crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. There's a symposium coming up, she said. An opportunity to compete against some of the brightest mathematical minds in the country. I've decided to submit your name for consideration. Malcolm blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected this. Thank you, Professor, he said again. Don't thank me yet, she said. This isn't a reward. It's a test. Let's see if you're as capable as you seem. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Malcolm to contemplate her words. He couldn't tell if her offer was an acknowledgement of his abilities or simply another challenge, a way for her to prove to herself, or to him, that he didn't belong, but it didn't matter. Malcolm had faced challenges before, and he wasn't about to back down now. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened, a day like any other, or so it seemed. The classroom buzzed with subdued energy, students murmuring to one another as they settled into their seats. Professor Whitman stood at the front, her usual commanding presence amplified by the stern expression on her face. She had just finished writing a particularly intricate equation on the board, its complexity filling the room with an almost palpable weight. This, she said, gesturing to the equation with her chalk, is a problem designed to challenge even the most advanced mathematicians. I expect each of you to approach it with the rigor and precision it demands. Malcolm studied the equation, his mind already piecing together its intricacies. It was a beautiful problem, one that required not just technical skill but also creative insight. He felt the familiar thrill of discovery stirring within him, the rush of excitement that only mathematics could bring. Whitman began to work through the problem on the board, her movements precise and deliberate. The classroom was silent, save for the soft scratch of chalk against slate. But as Malcolm watched her, a faint crease appeared on his brow. Something wasn't right. At first, he thought he must be mistaken. After all, this was Professor Whitman, a mathematician of unparalleled skill. But as she continued, the error became glaringly obvious. She had made a critical mistake in one of the early steps, a miscalculation that would render the entire solution incorrect. Malcolm hesitated. He didn't want to embarrass her in front of the class, but at the same time he couldn't let the mistake go uncorrected. Mathematics was about truth, and truth demanded honesty. He raised his hand. Whitman paused, her chalk hovering in midair. "Yes, Mr. Hayes?" she said, her tone laced with impatience. Malcolm cleared his throat, his voice steady but polite. "Professor, I believe there's an error in the second step. The coefficient you used doesn't align with the original equation." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Malcolm, a ripple of disbelief spreading through the class. No one interrupted Professor Whitman. Not like this. It was unthinkable. Whitman's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting that I've made a mistake?" she asked, her voice icy. "Yes, Professor," Malcolm replied, meeting her gaze. "If you'd like, I can explain why." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Some students exchanged nervous glances, while others leaned forward in their seats, eager to see how this would unfold. Emily Carter, sitting in the front row, smirked slightly, clearly expecting Malcolm to falter. Whitman arched an eyebrow. "Very well, Mr. Hayes," she said, stepping aside. "Please enlighten us." Malcolm rose from his seat, his movements calm and deliberate. He walked to the board, picking up a piece of chalk with a steady hand. For a moment, he stood in front of the equation, his eyes scanning it with practiced ease. Then, with a clarity that stunned the room, he began to rewrite the steps. "The issue lies here," he said, circling a specific term. "You used a value of 3, but based on the constraints of the problem, the correct coefficient should be -2. This changes the trajectory of the solution entirely." As he spoke, he worked through the corrected steps, each line flowing seamlessly into the next. His handwriting was neat and precise, his explanations clear and methodical. By the time he finished, the equation stood resolved, its elegance restored. Malcolm turned back to the class, his expression unreadable. "That's the correct solution," he said simply, placing the chalk back on the tray. For a moment no one spoke. The room was utterly still, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Whitman's face was a mask of controlled emotion, her sharp features betraying only the faintest hint of surprise. "Impressive," she said finally, her voice devoid of warmth. "But anyone can solve an equation with enough time. Let's see how you handle something more challenging." She turned back to the board, her movements brisk and almost aggressive. Within moments she had scrawled a new problem, one that was far more complex than the first. Its sheer size and intricacy made several students visibly recoil. "Care to try your hand at this, Mr. Hayes?" Whitman asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said, stepping forward. The next 10 minutes were a masterclass in mathematical brilliance. Whitman threw problem after problem at him, each one more difficult than the last. But Malcolm met every challenge with unwavering focus, his mind working at a pace that left the rest of the class in awe. He didn't just solve the problems. He explained them with a clarity and depth that made the solution seem almost obvious. By the time he finished the final problem, the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The students were no longer smirking or exchanging skeptical glances. Instead, they watched Malcolm with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Even Emily Carter, usually so self-assured, looked genuinely impressed. Whitman, however, was unreadable. Her expression was calm, almost detached, but there was a tightness in her jaw that betrayed her inner turmoil. She had underestimated him, and now the entire class knew it. "Well done, Mr. Hayes," she said finally, her tone measured. "You've proven yourself capable. Let's see if you can maintain that standard." Malcolm nodded, his face calm but his eyes alight with quiet determination. He returned to his seat, the weight of the moment settling over him. He hadn't set out to prove anything. He had simply spoken the truth. But in doing so, he had shifted the dynamics of the classroom in a way that could not be undone. As the lecture continued, Malcolm felt the weight of Whitman's gaze on him, sharper and more focused than ever. He knew this wasn't the end of her scrutiny. It was only the beginning, but he welcomed the challenge. He had spent his whole life proving himself in one way or another, and he wasn't about to stop now. The auditorium was abuzz with anticipation. Rows upon rows of eager spectators filled the expansive space, their conversations a low murmur as they awaited the start of the mathematics symposium. The competition had drawn some of the brightest minds from universities across the country, students with reputations as prodigies, geniuses, and future pioneers of the field. The stakes were high, and the atmosphere crackled with nervous energy. Malcolm Hayes stood off to the side, his hands tucked into the pockets of his blazer. He scanned the room quietly, his expression calm but focused. Around him, the other competitors chatted and exchanged pleasantries, their laughter tinged with the subtle undertones of rivalry. Malcolm, however, kept to himself. He had nothing to prove to them. His only goal was to approach the problems with the same passion and dedication that had always driven him. Professor Whitman arrived shortly after, her sharp gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on Malcolm. She approached him with her usual air of authority, her stride measured and purposeful. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone neutral. "Are you prepared?" "As prepared as I'll ever be," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. Whitman studied him for a moment, as though searching for cracks in his composure. Finding none, she gave a curt nod. "Good. Remember, this isn't just a test of your knowledge, it's a test of your resolve. Don't let the pressure get to you." "I won't," Malcolm said simply. Satisfied, Whitman moved to take her seat in the audience. Malcolm watched her go, her words lingering in his mind. He knew this wasn't just another classroom challenge. This was a chance to prove himself on a national stage, to show everyone, including Whitman, that he belonged here. The symposium began with little fanfare. A panel of distinguished judges took their seats at the front of the auditorium, their expressions stern and unreadable. The moderator, a silver-haired mathematician with a booming voice, stepped up to the podium and welcomed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "welcome to the annual Mathematics Symposium. Today, we will witness a battle of intellect and creativity as our competitors tackle some of the most challenging problems in the field. Let us begin." The first round was deceptively simple. Each competitor was given a straightforward problem to solve, a warm-up of sorts. Malcolm completed his in less than half the allotted time, his pencil gliding across the paper with effortless precision. He glanced around and noticed that many of his peers were still struggling, their brows furrowed in concentration. By the second round, the difficulty level had increased significantly. The problems now required a deeper understanding of calculus, as well as the ability to think critically under pressure. Malcolm thrived in this environment. His mind worked like a finely tuned machine, breaking down each problem into manageable components before assembling the solution with meticulous care. The judges began to take notice of him. They whispered among themselves, their eyes frequently darting toward Malcolm's workstation. Even Professor Whitman, seated near the back of the auditorium, leaned forward slightly, her normally stoic expression betraying a hint of curiosity. And then came the final round, a true test of brilliance. The competitors were presented with a single, extraordinarily complex problem that combined elements of calculus, linear algebra, and number theory. It was the kind of problem that could stump even seasoned mathematicians, a labyrinth of variables and constraints that required both analytical rigor and creative insight to solve. Malcolm stared at the problem, his mind racing. For the first time that day, he felt a flicker of uncertainty. The solution eluded him, its intricacies defying his usual methods of analysis. He could feel the weight of the audience's gaze, the pressure mounting with each passing second. But then, he took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a moment, shutting out the noise and the expectations. This wasn't about the competition, he reminded himself. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about the math, the beauty of the problem, the elegance of the solution. That was what mattered. When he opened his eyes, his mind was clear. He approached the problem from a different angle, examining it from a perspective he hadn't considered before. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. The solution revealed itself, not as a linear path but as a mosaic of ideas, each one building on the next. Malcolm's pencil moved with renewed confidence, his calculations precise and deliberate. The audience watched in awe as he worked, his focus unwavering. By the time he set down his pencil, the auditorium was silent. The judges reviewed the solutions, their deliberations taking longer than expected. Malcolm waited patiently, his hands folded in his lap. He felt no anxiety, no nervousness, only a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had done his best, and that was enough. Finally, the head judge stepped forward, a sheet of paper in his hand. "After careful consideration," he announced, "we have determined the winner of this year's mathematics symposium. Please join me in congratulating Malcolm Hayes from Columbia University." The room erupted into applause. Malcolm felt a wave of emotion wash over him, relief, pride, and a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he had ever experienced. He stood and walked to the stage, his steps steady and deliberate. When he accepted the certificate and shook the judge's hand, he couldn't help but glance toward the audience. Professor Whitman was watching him. Her expression was unreadable, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that might have been respect. The classroom was unusually quiet when Malcolm returned to Professor Whitman's advanced calculus class the following week. The hum of whispered conversations and the rustle of notebooks had been replaced by a charged silence, the kind that comes when people don't know quite how to act around someone who has changed the narrative. Malcolm took his usual seat in the third row, his notebook resting neatly on the desk in front of him. He could feel the weight of his classmates' eyes on him, their curiosity and newfound respect, palpable. Emily Carter, who had always carried herself with an air of superiority, offered him a small, hesitant smile as he glanced her way. Others nodded at him in acknowledgement, their subtle gestures speaking volumes. But Malcolm wasn't here for their approval. He wasn't here for anyone's approval. He had learned long ago that his worth wasn't determined by the opinions of others, no matter how loud or quiet those opinions might be. What mattered to him was the pursuit of knowledge, the thrill of solving problems, the beauty of mathematics. Professor Whitman entered the room precisely on time, as she always did. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, her expression as composed as ever. She placed her briefcase on the desk, removed a folder, and began writing on the board without so much as a glance at the class. The equation she scrawled was complex, its intricacies filling the room with a familiar sense of challenge. When she finished, she turned to face the class. Her gaze swept over them, pausing briefly on Malcolm. The faintest flicker of something, acknowledgement perhaps, crossed her face before she addressed the room. "Today we'll be exploring a new approach to solving differential equations," she said, her tone as crisp as ever. "Open your notebooks." The lecture proceeded as usual, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Malcolm no longer felt the subtle skepticism in Whitman's gaze, or the unspoken tension that had once defined their interactions. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, an unspoken truce. She no longer called on him with the intent to test him, nor did she scrutinize his answers with the same sharpness. It wasn't quite respect. Whitman wasn't one to lavish praise, but it was the closest thing to it. As the class ended and the students began to gather their things, Whitman spoke. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice cutting through the soft chatter. "A moment, please." Malcolm approached her desk, his expression calm. "Yes, Professor?" She regarded him for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face. "You performed well at the symposium," she said finally. "Better than I expected." "Thank you," Malcolm replied evenly. Whitman nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You have potential," she said. "Don't waste it." Her words were measured, devoid of warmth, but Malcolm understood the weight behind them. This was as close to an apology or an acknowledgement as he was likely to get, and that was fine. He didn't need her validation. He never had. "I won't," he said simply. For a moment they stood in silence, the tension between them finally dissipating. Then Whitman turned back to her desk, her attention already shifting to the next task. Malcolm, however, felt a quiet sense of closure. He had proven himself not just to her, but to everyone who had ever doubted him. More importantly, he had proven something to himself. As he left the classroom, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift. The symposium, the challenges, the subtle biases he had faced, it was all behind him now. But the lessons he had learned would stay with him. He had discovered that success wasn't about seeking approval or validation. It was about staying true to himself, about pursuing his passions with integrity and determination. The hallway was bright with afternoon sunlight as Malcolm stepped outside, his notebook tucked under his arm. The world felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. He walked away from the classroom, his steps steady, his heart light. He didn't look back. And somewhere in the quiet recesses of her mind, Professor Whitman, though she would never admit it, was already rethinking the assumptions she had once held. Malcolm Hayes wasn't just a student. He was a force to be reckoned with, a reminder that brilliance knew no boundaries, no molds, no expectations. For Malcolm, however, that wasn't the point. He didn't need to be a symbol or a lesson. He was simply himself, a mathematician, a thinker, a young man with infinite potential, and that was more than enough.